I never thought a cup of coffee could mark the end of everything I thought I knew about my home. I remember the morning clearly, sunlight slanting through the blinds, casting lines across the kitchen floor like some quiet, indifferent witness to the chaos that was about to unfold. I was tired, sure, but nothing had prepared me for the moment when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a bad morning. I was standing in the middle of a war I didn't even sign up for. It started with her son. Not my son, her son. He had this way of thinking the world owed him something because he'd been inconvenienced once or twice in life. That morning, he asked for money again, a new emergency that, in his mind, deserved immediate fulfillment. I refused. I'd had enough of covering for mistakes I didn't make, of being the silent bank while watching him waste opportunity after opportunity. And when I said no, I saw it, the flash of anger in my wife's eyes, a mix of disbelief and indignation. I said no, I told him firmly, trying to keep my voice even. "Give me the card then," he snapped, like I had no right to set boundaries in my own home. Before I could respond, she was there. She didn't even hesitate. The cup in her hand seemed to float in the air for a heartbeat before spilling over me. Hot coffee hit my chest, searing through the shirt I'd chosen carefully for work, and I felt the sting like a jolt straight to my dignity. "Give money or get out," she screamed, her voice slicing through the morning calm like glass breaking. For a second, time froze. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with the sharp, bitter taste of betrayal. I wanted to yell back, to let the heat of the moment carry me into the same reckless rage she had chosen. I wanted to shake her, to tell her exactly what I thought about the way she treated me, about the way she treated him, about the way she treated the life we had together, or at least the life I had thought we had. But I didn't. I walked away. I walked away not because I was weak, but because I realized the only power she had over me was the one I allowed her to hold. I left the kitchen, my heart pounding, the sting of the coffee burning both skin and pride, and I walked into the quiet of the living room. I could hear her behind me, shouting, accusing, trying to pull me back into the chaos she thrived on. I stood there, silent, listening to her, letting the words wash over me without grabbing hold. Every insult, every demand, every accusation ricocheted inside me, but I let it pass. Because I knew she didn't get to define me in this moment. I did. I could feel the heat of the coffee fading against my chest, but the heat of betrayal lingered. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my anger, smoothed over the cracks, tried to maintain peace at the expense of my own sanity. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental. I could no longer ignore the truth about the life I was living. I had been a participant in a story that no longer made sense to me, one where my values and boundaries were negotiable at the whim of someone else's temper. She stopped shouting, finally, when she realized I wasn't moving. The silence after her storm was almost more unsettling than the storm itself. I could feel her eyes on me, sharp, calculating, probably planning her next move. I wondered if she had any idea how detached I had become, how much space I was claiming inside myself that she would never be able to reach. I remembered the small details as I walked past the dining room table. The scattered bills she'd left unpaid, the way her son had lounged on the couch like none of this was real, the echo of my own frustration bouncing off the walls. Each detail piled up, forming a picture I couldn't unsee. This wasn't just about money or coffee or a single argument. It was about control, about respect, about the life I wanted versus the life I was being forced to endure. I went to the front door, slipping on my shoes with deliberate slowness. Every movement felt ritualistic, like I was shedding an old skin I hadn't realized I'd been wearing for years. I opened the door and stepped outside, letting the cool morning air hit my face. The sun felt different somehow, sharper, as if it was challenging me to see clearly for the first time in years. I didn't look back. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I didn't even glance at her. I just walked. Step by step, I let the morning carry me forward, away from the noise, the anger, the chaos. I thought about what this meant, not just for the morning, but for every morning that had come before it and every morning that would come after if nothing changed. And I knew something important. Leaving was not the end. It was the beginning. That night, I sat in the quiet of a small cafe, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and thinking about the choices I had made. I replayed the scene over and over in my mind, not with regret, but with clarity. I realized how little of myself I had been willing to claim. I realized how long I had allowed others, her son, even my own fears, to dictate the boundaries of my life. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of power, quiet but undeniable. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if she would apologize, if her son would ever take responsibility, if life could return to something resembling normal. All I knew was that I had made a choice. A choice not to surrender, not to let anger dictate my actions, not to lose myself in the chaos of someone else's making. As I walked home later that evening, the streets empty under the dim glow of streetlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the first move in a game far bigger than a spilled cup of coffee. I felt a plan forming, subtle at first, like a whisper at the edge of my mind. I would reclaim what was mine, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because if I didn't, who would? And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I stepped inside my house again, but it felt different. The walls, the furniture, even the familiar creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with possibility. I wasn't the same man who had walked in that morning. I had crossed a threshold without realizing it. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of that chaos, a reckoning was already taking shape, one she wouldn't see coming. Because I had walked away. And walking away, I realized, was the first step toward taking everything back. I returned home that evening with a strange sense of calm, but the silence inside the house was deafening. Every step I took echoed, reminding me of the absence of chaos, yet hinting at the tension that had never truly left. The kitchen, still faintly scented of coffee, felt alien, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next eruption. I noticed the scattered bills on the counter, some unopened, some shoved carelessly into drawers. It was a portrait of negligence I had always tried to ignore, and now it confronted me directly. I sank into the living room couch, letting my body relax for the first time in weeks. But my mind refused to do the same. I thought about the morning, about the way she had stormed through my life with rage and entitlement. I thought about her son, lounging as if the world owed him something he hadn't earned. And I realized that nothing would ever change unless I decided to change it myself. Sitting there, I allowed myself to think freely for the first time in a long while. Questions I had buried surfaced. Why had I let this go on? Why had I let someone else define my boundaries and dictate the rules of my home? And most importantly, what did I want my life to look like moving forward? The answers weren't simple, but for the first time, I felt clarity peeking through the fog of frustration and resentment. I started walking through the rooms, each step revealing more evidence of disregard. The bedroom still cluttered with her son's careless habits, the laundry left unfolded, the stacks of unpaid bills signaling a lack of accountability. And yet, in each of these small reminders, I also saw opportunity. Opportunity to reclaim control, to enforce boundaries, to create a life where my values mattered more than someone else's convenience. I sat back at the dining table, pulling out my laptop, and began making quiet mental notes. A plan for restoring order, a strategy for asserting boundaries, a path forward that didn't rely on confrontation but on deliberate action. I realized that my anger could be a tool rather than a burden, an engine to drive me toward reclaiming the respect I had let slip through my fingers. Hours passed in reflective thought. I went over every moment of the morning, replaying it with meticulous attention. I noted the precise ways I had allowed myself to be manipulated and reminded myself that I wouldn't make those same mistakes again. It wasn't about revenge yet, not in the dramatic sense, but it was about positioning myself in a place of power, calm, and deliberate decision-making. I could feel a subtle shift within me, a quiet empowerment. The house that had felt like a prison hours ago now seemed like a stage where I could begin writing a new narrative. The tension that had been choking me loosened slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. I knew that when she returned, things wouldn't be the same. I was no longer just reacting, I was preparing. A knock at the door startled me. I froze, my mind racing through every possibility. But when I opened it, it was just the neighbor, Mrs. Patel, checking in. Her casual greeting and small talk only emphasized how little she, or anyone else, understood the storm brewing behind closed doors. She left, and I was alone again, yet strangely invigorated by the solitude. I moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street, imagining how things might unfold in the days ahead. I didn't know exactly when she would return, or what she would do when she stepped inside, but I knew one thing: the next time she saw me, I would not be the man she had tried to humiliate. In that moment, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The morning's chaos had lit a fire in me that nothing could easily extinguish. I had walked away, yes, but I had also opened a door to clarity, to power, and to a reckoning that was quietly taking shape. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first stirrings of a plan that would change everything. I ended the night sitting in the stillness of my home, notebook in hand, outlining small steps to regain control. Bills, boundaries, finances, and ultimately, respect. Each line I wrote reinforced my sense of agency. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was preparing. Preparing for a confrontation that wasn't yet visible, preparing for her return, and preparing for a version of life where I would no longer be a passive participant. The house was empty, but it was no longer oppressive. It was a canvas, waiting for me to reclaim it, to draw the lines she had never respected. And as I finally turned off the lights and let darkness fill the rooms, I whispered to myself, almost as a promise, "This is only the beginning. I am not the man I was this morning. And when she walks back through that door, everything will be different." The days after that morning passed in a blur, but I could feel the tension building with each quiet moment in the house. I knew it wasn't just about the coffee, or the yelling, or even the entitlement of her son. It was about trust, control, and the betrayal that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface for years. Sitting in the living room, I replayed the incident repeatedly, dissecting every gesture, every word, every choice. And the more I thought, the clearer it became. This was bigger than I had initially realized. I began going through our finances, not as a casual glance but as a meticulous investigation. Bills unpaid, credit card statements with unaccounted withdrawals, mysterious charges that made my stomach turn. Her son had been using the card recklessly, and she had been enabling him at every turn. Every line on the statement felt like a stab, a proof of their disregard, their manipulation, their casual assumption that I would always cover the mess. The betrayal cut deeper than any coffee burn could. I sat back, letting the information sink in. My mind raced with possibilities. Confront her now, call it out, demand answers. But every instinct told me to pause. Anger had its place, but clarity had more power. This wasn't a moment for reaction. It was a moment for strategy. And so I began to plot, quietly, deliberately, using my growing sense of control as a weapon of its own. Walking past the kitchen, I noticed remnants of that morning. The stained cup, the scattered papers, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air like a ghost. I realized that her fury had left marks not just on my shirt but on the life we were supposed to share. Each mark was a reminder of how far things had slipped, how little respect had been left, and how necessary it was for me to reclaim what had been quietly stolen. Her son lounged on the couch, phone in hand, oblivious. The audacity, the arrogance, it made my blood boil, yet I kept my composure. This is going to end differently, I told myself quietly. Not with yelling, not with storms, but with clarity and with control. I decided to confront the financial chaos first. I called the bank and froze certain accounts, set limits, and requested detailed transaction histories. Each call was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming control, and a quiet assertion of power. I felt the shift within me. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't at the mercy of their whims. For the first time in years, I was actively shaping the life around me rather than reacting to it. Late that evening, I found myself in the study, reviewing statements and records. The betrayal was exhaustive, but so was my resolve. I jotted notes in a small notebook outlining what needed to be addressed, what boundaries had to be set, and what conversations were inevitable. I could feel my own anger simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered now with focus. Anger without direction was destructive, anger with purpose could be transformative. The first confrontation came quietly. Her son came into the study, expecting some easy distraction, some attempt to placate him. Instead, I looked up calmly, my voice steady. "We need to talk about the charges on this account," I said. "Not an accusation, just a statement of fact." He looked startled and then defensive. "It's just a few things." "It's nothing." "Nothing?" I asked, letting the word linger. "It's hundreds and you know it. I'm not covering it this time." He flinched, muttered something about mistakes and apologies, but the seed of accountability had been planted. I watched him, noting the flicker of realization that this wasn't going to be brushed aside. It was the first step, small but essential, toward enforcing boundaries that had long been ignored. Later, I reflected on the conversation, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and lingering tension. Satisfying as it was to assert control, the betrayal I had uncovered revealed the depth of the problem. My wife had been complicit in this behavior, whether through indifference or encouragement. The full scope of the conflict was now clear. It wasn't just about one morning, or one cup of coffee, or one refusal. It was about reclaiming authority, respect, and boundaries that had been ignored for far too long. I also realized that this was about me, my identity, my values, my sense of self-worth. I couldn't allow the chaos of others to dictate how I felt or who I was. The betrayal had cut deep, but it also lit a fire. Every stolen dollar, every lie, every bit of disregard became motivation. I would no longer be a passive participant. I would no longer allow anger or frustration to control my actions. I was beginning to see a path forward, one defined by clear rules, deliberate steps, and an unwavering commitment to myself. As the night deepened, I allowed myself a small moment of reflection. The betrayal was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. I understood now that reclaiming control wasn't about immediate revenge. It was about preparation, about strategy, about turning anger into action. The house was quiet again, but inside, my mind was anything but. I was planning, observing, and laying the groundwork for what was coming. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could sense the tension rising toward a crescendo. The confrontation with her son was just the beginning. The full reckoning with her would require patience, precision, and courage. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not be blindsided again. I would not allow betrayal to define me. And when the moment came, I would be ready. That night, as I finally closed my notebook and turned off the lights, I felt a quiet, unshakable determination. The morning coffee had been an insult, but the betrayal revealed the stakes. And now, fully aware of the battlefield, I knew exactly what I had to do next. The game had begun, and I was no longer a player without a plan. I was preparing for control, for clarity, and for a reckoning that would change everything. The next chapter in this life, my life, was about to unfold. By the fourth day, I could feel a shift in the air, both in the house and inside myself. The morning coffee incident felt less like a single confrontation and more like a signal, an alarm I could no longer ignore. The chaos wasn't just external, it had been shaping my thoughts, my patience, my sense of self. And now, for the first time, I realized I had the ability to transform that chaos into something deliberate. I had the chance to reclaim control, to draw lines that couldn't be crossed, and to plan a course that wouldn't leave me at the mercy of her or her son. I began by quietly mapping out the entire landscape of the household. The finances, the daily routines, the hidden habits that had long been ignored. Each observation was a data point, each pattern a clue. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was analyzing. This wasn't about immediate revenge, it was about positioning, about understanding the terrain before making a move. Her son, oblivious to my internal shift, carried on as if nothing had changed. He lounged on the couch, scrolling through his phone, laughing at videos I didn't find funny, leaving crumbs and papers in his wake. Normally, this would have irritated me instantly. But now, I saw it as information. His arrogance and indifference became tools in my planning. Every careless action revealed weaknesses I could later leverage. Every assumption he made about my passivity was a point in my favor. I pulled out my notebook, and for hours I outlined steps to regain authority over my home and my life. Finances, rules, responsibilities, Each had to be addressed systematically. I started drafting letters and emails, not as confrontations, but as frameworks to document boundaries and expectations. If the morning had been about chaos, the night was about clarity. And in that clarity, I found a growing sense of empowerment. I also considered her role in all of this. She had enabled and encouraged the behavior that had humiliated me, and any future confrontation would need to address her as much as her son. But I didn't rush it. The plan had to unfold with precision. Immediate confrontation without preparation could easily backfire. Patience was my weapon now, and deliberate action my strategy. Late into the night, I took small but significant steps. I adjusted account limits, set alerts, and contacted institutions to ensure oversight. Each action was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it added layers of control that had been absent before. As I worked, I felt a subtle exhilaration, the realization that I wasn't powerless anymore, that each small decision was carving a new path forward. The house, once oppressive and chaotic, began to feel like a stage on which I could orchestrate change. I moved from room to room, taking stock, observing, noting the things that had previously frustrated me. And in this observation, I discovered a sense of calm. The chaos was still present, yes, but I was no longer a passive victim. I was the one directing the story now, and that alone was empowering. A knock at the door interrupted my planning. I froze, assessing whether it was her, a neighbor, or some unexpected visitor. When I opened it, it was a delivery man with a package addressed to me. Inside was a briefcase I had ordered days before, filled with documents, organizational tools, and folders for my meticulous record-keeping. The timing felt almost symbolic, as if the universe itself had provided reinforcement. I smiled to myself, silently acknowledging the shift. The power was moving back into my hands, step by step. That night, I sat by the window, notebook in lap, observing the quiet street. The solitude was a gift, an opportunity to think clearly and act deliberately. Each passing hour, each quiet moment, reinforced a fundamental truth. I would no longer be defined by others' chaos or arrogance. I would act according to my own rules, with patience, clarity, and precision. I began to imagine the coming days, the interactions, the confrontations, the moments when her assumptions about my passivity would collide with the reality of my preparation. I allowed myself a small, private thrill at the thought. This wasn't about petty revenge, it was about establishing respect, asserting boundaries, and reclaiming dignity in a space that had long been dominated by entitlement and disregard. By the end of the night, I had outlined not just immediate steps but a sequence of actions for the days ahead. I knew which conversations needed to happen first, which behaviors needed correction, and how to handle potential pushback. Each element of the plan was deliberate, and each reinforced a growing sense of control that I had not felt in years. As I closed my notebook and extinguished the lamp, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan coming together. The morning's chaos had lit a spark, but it was the deliberate preparation, the methodical plotting, that would ensure lasting change. I was no longer reacting to circumstances, I was shaping them. And when the time came to confront, to assert, and to reclaim, I would do so with confidence, clarity, and authority. I lay in bed that night, thoughts buzzing with strategy and anticipation. The house was quiet, but my mind was alive with possibilities. I had transformed the morning's humiliation into a blueprint for empowerment. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the next phase of this story was about to begin, and when it did, nothing would be the same. I thought I had a handle on things, that my plan was unfolding neatly, that the chaos had been contained to manageable edges. But life has a way of reminding you that control is often an illusion. Just when I felt the momentum shifting in my favor, an unexpected complication arrived that threatened to unravel everything I had begun to orchestrate. It started with a phone call late in the afternoon. A stranger, crisp and professional, identified himself as someone who had been in contact with my wife regarding her son's recent activities. He spoke in measured tones, delivering information that was both shocking and alarming. The scope of the stepson's recklessness was far greater than I had realized, touching matters I hadn't yet accounted for. It wasn't just financial, it was personal, legal, and potentially humiliating if left unchecked. I felt my stomach tighten, a familiar tension rising in my chest. This wasn't supposed to be part of the plan, yet here it was, forcing me to adapt, to pivot. I realized that my careful preparations had been based on incomplete information. The stakes were higher than I had imagined, and the margin for error had narrowed drastically. I spent the evening piecing together what had been revealed, cross-referencing it with my own observations, and mapping out new contingencies. Every note I made, every calculation, was a step toward regaining the upper hand. My mind raced, but beneath the panic, a strange clarity emerged. I could feel the pulse of opportunity within the chaos. This twist, as inconvenient as it was, also offered leverage. If handled correctly, it could strengthen my position rather than weaken it. Meanwhile, her son continued to act with the same careless arrogance, unaware that his actions were no longer trivial. I watched him, taking mental notes of his patterns, his assumptions, his blind spots. Each one was a potential opening, a way to assert control without descending into confrontation. The twist had complicated things, yes, but it also illuminated the vulnerabilities that had always been there, unnoticed until now. Late into the night, I contacted a trusted professional, a lawyer I had dealt with years ago, explaining the situation in measured terms. I wasn't asking for intervention yet, I was gathering insight, understanding the legal landscape, and determining my options. The call reassured me, even unexpected complications could be leveraged with preparation and foresight. Power, I realized, was about anticipation as much as action. Her return was imminent, though I didn't know the exact timing. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, preparing mentally for the encounters ahead. Every step I took reinforced my authority, every action a subtle assertion that this house, and my life, would no longer be defined by their recklessness. I could sense the tension rising within me, a mix of anticipation and readiness. The twist had forced me to sharpen my focus, to be more precise, more deliberate, more strategic. I reflected on the situation quietly, recognizing a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Her son had always relied on her to shield him from consequences, and she had always assumed I would acquiesce. That assumption would no longer hold. The twist had revealed not just vulnerability, but the potential for a dramatic reversal of control. I felt a quiet satisfaction at the prospect, a thrill at the thought of turning their assumptions against them. The night deepened, and I settled into a rhythm of observation and planning. Each complication became a calculated data point, each unexpected revelation a chance to refine my strategy. I wasn't reacting in panic. I was absorbing, analyzing, and preparing. The twist had shifted the landscape, yes, but it had also provided clarity about what truly mattered: control, respect, and the ability to act decisively when the time came. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, looking out the window at the quiet street below. The world outside seemed indifferent, but inside, the currents of change were powerful and precise. I knew that the coming days would test my patience and resolve, but I also knew that I was ready. Every setback, every unexpected twist, was now a part of the plan, woven into the strategy one had built with care and foresight. As I finally turned off the lights and retreated to my room, I felt the steady pulse of determination in my chest. The house was quiet, but the stage was set. The complications, rather than derailing me, had strengthened my understanding and sharpened my focus. I was no longer simply responding to chaos. I was anticipating it, ready to turn it into opportunity. And somewhere deep inside, I smiled at the thought. The game was more complex now, but I was more prepared than ever to play and win. The day had arrived, though I didn't know exactly when she would walk through the door. I had spent hours mentally rehearsing every scenario, anticipating reactions, and preparing responses. I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes from knowing you are ready, that comes from having turned chaos into strategy. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, but I barely noticed. My attention was focused inward, on the careful equilibrium I had built and the confrontation that was about to test it. When the door finally opened, I didn't rise immediately. I let her step in, watched her reaction as she took in the quiet order of the house. For a moment, She seemed to hesitate, perhaps sensing that the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted. I could feel her tension, sharp and brittle, radiating from her posture and expression. The air itself felt charged, electric with the anticipation of what was coming. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice sharp but uneven, betraying uncertainty beneath the anger. "I've been thinking," I said calmly, standing slowly, "about boundaries, responsibility, and respect." Her eyes narrowed. "Thinking? About what?" "About the life I want to lead, and the respect I deserve in my own home." My voice was steady, deliberate. Each word carried the weight of months of frustration, analysis, and preparation. She blinked, momentarily disarmed by the clarity and calm I radiated. The tension in the room shifted. She had expected confrontation, but not control. We moved into the living room, where her son was lounging, oblivious to the tension between us. I addressed him first, laying out the expectations and consequences in a firm, unshakable tone. "The credit card usage stops now," I said. "No exceptions. No arguments. You will be responsible for your actions, starting today." He flinched, muttered something about apologies, but I held my ground. Every instinct I had, every ounce of preparation, guided my words. There was no room for negotiation, no opportunity for manipulation. The balance of power had shifted. Then I turned to her. "And you," I said quietly but firmly, "will respect those boundaries. This isn't just about money. This is about accountability, respect, and the life we share. If that cannot happen, then we have a deeper problem to address." Her face hardened, a familiar shield rising in defense. She tried to argue, tried to twist the narrative, but I didn't let her redirect the focus. I had rehearsed this, anticipated every twist, and I remained unshaken. Each attempt she made to undermine me was met with clarity, calm, and an unwavering commitment to the truth I had uncovered. The confrontation lasted longer than I expected, but it was precise and controlled. I didn't raise my voice unnecessarily. I didn't lose composure. Instead, I let the facts speak, let the patterns of behavior reveal themselves, and allowed the quiet force of preparedness to dominate the room. By the end, the tension had shifted entirely. Her son had accepted, reluctantly, the reality of boundaries. She had no choice but to acknowledge the structure I had imposed. Afterward, I sat alone in the living room, letting the adrenaline fade. The confrontation had been exhausting, but it had also been empowering. I had claimed authority in a space that had long been chaotic, and for the first time, I felt truly in control of my home and my life. The air felt lighter, the walls no longer oppressive, and the house, once a battlefield, now seemed like a foundation for a new chapter. I reflected on the moment, understanding that this turning point wasn't just about the immediate control I had asserted. It was about reclaiming my identity, asserting my values, and demonstrating to myself that I could stand firm without compromise. The morning coffee incident, the betrayal, the planning, all had led to this precise, pivotal confrontation. And I had emerged not only victorious but transformed. As evening fell, I walked through the quiet house, observing the subtle changes. The chaos was not completely gone. Life rarely is, but the balance had shifted. The rules were clear, the boundaries firm, and the foundation for a new, more empowered life had been laid. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the anticipation of what would come next. A life where I was no longer defined by the recklessness or assumptions of others, but by my own clarity, strength, and deliberate actions. That night, as I sat by the window watching the world outside, I realized that this turning point marked more than just the end of confrontation. It marked the beginning of self-empowerment, the reclamation of dignity, and the emergence of a man no longer willing to surrender his life to the whims of others. The real journey had just begun, and I was ready for it. The days following the confrontation were a mix of tense anticipation and quiet observation. I had established boundaries, enforced rules, and seen compliance, but the true test was yet to come. The reckoning wasn't about yelling or blame or even punishment. It was about facing the full consequences of the choices that had led to this moment. And I was ready. It started subtly. She moved through the house differently now, quieter, hesitant, as if testing the limits of the structure I had imposed. Her son followed her lead, subdued but watchful, aware that his previous assumptions about control were no longer valid. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was visible in every gesture, every glance, every cautious movement. I watched them, noting their adjustments, their attempts to regain a sense of normalcy within the boundaries I had defined. It was fascinating, almost clinical, to observe how quickly patterns of defiance had transformed into tentative respect. And yet, I knew the real reckoning would require more than observation. It would require confrontation with the choices and behaviors that had caused the upheaval in the first place. The moment arrived in the form of a calm evening, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room. I gathered both of them, her son and my wife, and laid out the facts, calmly and deliberately. I recounted the financial discrepancies, the repeated boundary violations, the patterns of disregard that had gone unchecked for far too long. My voice was steady, deliberate, unwavering. Everything we do in this house, I said, must be built on respect, responsibility, and accountability. Anything less is unacceptable. Her eyes narrowed, trying to hide frustration, but the weight of evidence and the calm authority in my voice left little room for denial. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the house, the finances, and the life we shared were no longer her playground. The responsibility had shifted, and I was no longer a passive participant. Her son looked down, quietly acknowledging the boundaries he had previously ignored. I could see the subtle shift in him, the realization that entitlement had consequences. He understood, finally, that his actions were no longer shielded by avoidance or distraction. The reckoning was not punitive, it was transformative, and the lesson was clear: responsibility is unavoidable. I took a deep breath, feeling the culmination of weeks of preparation, observation, and strategic planning. This was the apex of the struggle, the point where chaos and control collided, and the outcome would define the emotional landscape moving forward. I realized that my own transformation was mirrored in the room. I was no longer reactive, no longer defined by others' whims, but by deliberate, confident, measured action. The conversation continued, not with anger, but with clarity. I set expectations, laid out responsibilities, and made it unequivocally clear that respect and accountability were non-negotiable. Each word, each statement reinforced the structure I had established. The atmosphere, once tense and unpredictable, now resonated with a cautious equilibrium. The reckoning had been delivered, not as punishment, but as an assertion of principles and a declaration of self-respect. Later, alone in the quiet of the house, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The hot coffee incident, the betrayal, the meticulous planning, the confrontation, they had all been necessary steps leading to this climax. And now, having faced the reckoning, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. I had reclaimed my space, my boundaries, and my dignity, and I had done so without compromising my integrity or escalating conflict unnecessarily. The house, once a battleground, now felt like a sanctuary. Each room, each corner, each familiar sound carried a new weight, a testament to control, clarity, and the emotional growth I had achieved. I realized that the climax wasn't just about asserting authority, it was about embracing who I had become, a man capable of standing firm, acting deliberately, and navigating complexity with both patience and resolve. As the night settled over the quiet streets outside, I felt a deep satisfaction. The reckoning was complete, the boundaries clear, and the respect I had demanded had been established. I had faced the storm and emerged stronger, more confident, and fully aware of my own capacity for deliberate action. And somewhere, in the stillness of the night, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The struggle had not just been about them, it had been about me, about reclaiming control, dignity, and clarity. The game was won, not through anger, but through strategy, patience, and unwavering commitment to what I knew was right. The climax had been reached, and the resolution, emotional, strategic, and personal, was finally within sight. The morning after the reckoning felt different, almost surreal. The house, once heavy with tension and chaos, now carried a quiet order that was both unfamiliar and comforting. I moved through the rooms deliberately, observing the subtle changes. Her son tidying up after himself, small gestures of responsibility, and even her demeanor shifted, more cautious, more aware, less presumptuous. The balance had been restored, but more importantly, I had reclaimed the life that had been slipping through my fingers for years. I sat at the dining table with my notebook, reviewing the plans I had executed, the boundaries I had established, and the conversations I had facilitated. It struck me how far I had come, from reacting to chaos, from absorbing disrespect and manipulation, to creating a structured, empowered environment that reflected my values. The house wasn't just physically quieter, it symbolized my regained agency, my clarity, and my emotional growth. Her son, once so arrogant and entitled, approached me quietly. "I'll try," he said, voice hesitant but genuine. I nodded, acknowledging his attempt without overpraising it. This was not about instant redemption, it was about accountability and consistency. Every action now mattered, and he was beginning to understand that. My wife, too, seemed to sense the shift. There was no apology at first, but a recognition in her eyes that the dynamic had changed. I realized that control and respect could not be demanded with anger, they had to be asserted with clarity, patience, and consequence. And in this quiet acknowledgement, I saw the first signs of a recalibrated relationship, one grounded in accountability rather than assumption. I took a deep breath and walked through the house, pausing in each room to absorb the quiet energy that had replaced tension. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would require continued diligence, but the foundations were set. I had reclaimed my boundaries, my voice, and my sense of self, and that was enough to start building the life I wanted. Later, I sat by the window, watching the street bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sun. The chaos of the past weeks, the coffee, the betrayal, the confrontations, had shaped me, sharpened me, and propelled me toward clarity. I had learned that walking away wasn't weakness, it was a strategic choice. I had discovered that patience, planning, and deliberate action were far more powerful than immediate reactions fueled by anger. As evening fell, I reflected on the transformation. I was no longer the man who had endured humiliation in silence, who had absorbed disrespect without action, who had allowed others to define his boundaries. I was now a man who could assert control, set expectations, and reclaim dignity without sacrificing composure. The lessons were hard-earned, but they had reshaped not just my home, but my identity. I finally sat back in the quiet living room, letting the stillness wash over me. The house was calm, the air was lighter, and the emotional weight that had clung to me for years had begun to lift. I had confronted chaos, managed betrayal, and emerged with clarity, strength, and a renewed sense of purpose. And as I closed my eyes, I realized something profound. The journey had never been just about coffee or money or rebellion, it had been about me. About reclaiming my life, my agency, and my values. About proving to myself that I could navigate complexity with calm, strategy, and integrity. The resolution wasn't just external, it was deeply internal, a transformation that would shape every choice I made going forward. I smiled quietly, a sense of empowerment settling deep within. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was my sanctuary, my domain, a reflection of who I had become. And in that moment, I knew that walking away had not been an ending, but the first step toward reclaiming everything I had almost lost. My life was mine again, and for the first time in years, I felt fully in control.